So we start off with the second part of coverage of international relations laser focus. And the topic that we are going to discuss now is treaties, agreements, and conventions. That is the fourth part of the laser focus IR magazine. Okay. So the first topic there is India-Russia reciprocal exchange of logistics support agreement, the RELOS agreement. What we have to know clearly is that this agreement has been signed between India and Russia. The name of the agreement is important because they can ask about this particular agreement, and they can ask which country has India signed the RELOS agreement with. So you have to have a clear idea that it is with Russia, and you have to also know that it is for support, logistical support between the two militaries across the domains, like with regards to air force, with regards to naval support, with regards to army support, etc. So for all of that, this RELOS agreement has been signed. Okay, if you have rough idea about it, that's more or less enough. You don't need to know too much into it. Then comes WTO complaint, China's WTO complaint against India over subsidies. So China has gone to the World Trade Organization and has complained against India's production-linked incentive schemes. So against the PLI scheme, it has claimed that the PLI schemes are contravening the WTO law and are creating unfair competition. And with regards to this, we are supposed to be clear about the WTO's subsidies and countervailing measures agreement. And this particular SCM agreement regulates the industrial subsidies at the World Trade Organization. So we have to be clear about this. We also need to be clear about the fact that industrial subsidies are a sovereign right. So every country does have the right to have industrial subsidies. However, at the same time, World Trade Organization restricts those industrial subsidies that distort trade or create unfair competition. Okay, these are challenged at the WTO, and then if at all it is found violating to the WTO law, the WTO may order the withdrawal of such subsidies. Now, there are three major categories of subsidies. One is prohibited, one is actionable, and the third one is non-actionable subsidies. The non-actionable subsidies are those subsidies on which the WTO will not object to application of. So like the prohibited ones are supposed to be not ever put, and the actionable subsidies are those on which action might be taken if they are contravening to the WTO law, and non-actionable subsidies are those subsidies on which WTO does not try to regulate the introduction of subsidies at. So that is the thing. Then we go to prohibited subsidies. In the prohibited subsidies, we need to clearly know that there are two kinds of subsidies under this category. One is export subsidies and another one is import substitution subsidy. Okay. The export subsidies are essentially those subsidies which are contingent upon export performance. For example, if Indian exporters are said that if you will export 5 to 7% of commodity, of a particular commodity, then you will get a subsidy of, say, 1,000 rupees or etc. Then you can say that this is an export subsidy, which is contingent upon overall export performance by an exporter. Similarly, import substitution subsidies are contingent on use of domestic goods over imported goods, and that is also prohibited by the World Trade Organization. So where if the government is saying that you are supposed to use domestic goods and not the imported ones so as to produce anything, and so as to get the support, like subsidy support from us, then that is considered discriminatory, that is considered trade distorting, and that is why it is considered prohibited under the WTO law. So you have to have a rough idea about this. Then comes the extradition law. Extradition is something that has been in the news regularly, particularly with regards to cases of fugitives like Mehul Choksi or Nirav Modi, etc. And also in the context of Bangladesh's former prime minister being in India. Okay. So we have to have certain idea about extradition. We are also supposed to know what the Indian law says about extradition offense, and in what cases, under what circumstances can extradition treaties be taken. Okay. Can extradition be taken? So this has to be clear to us. So the Extradition Act defines an extradition offense in two ways. One is that for treaty countries, it refers to offenses listed in the relevant bilateral agreement. So if there is a country with which we have signed the extradition agreement, then it will refer to those offenses that are listed in that particular agreement. For those which are non-treaty states, it covers offenses punishable with at least 1 year of imprisonment under Indian on foreign law, including composite offenses. So that's what we have to be clear about. Then we have to also know that India has signed extradition treaties with a majority of those countries where extradition might be possible, like safe havens like Mauritius, Belgium, UK. We've also signed it with Bangladesh, etc. So as you can see, we have already signed extradition treaties with 48 countries. Okay. So we have to be clear about this particular part, and we have to have a rough idea of the countries with which we have signed it. Also, another thing that we should notice that if there is no treaty that exists between India and a particular state where we want extradition from, then then the 1962 Act allows India to use international conventions such as those of corruption and organized crime as extradition treaties if both the countries are parties to that particular convention or treaty. So, for example, India is a signatory as well as has ratified the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Similarly, India has signed and ratified the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. So both of these we have to be clear about. If another country has signed or ratified these, then India can have an extradition under the provisions of these conventions. Then India also specifies in its own law of Extradition Act 1962 the various grounds on which refusal of extradition is possible. So, for example, extradition can be denied if the offense is of a political or military character. Extradition can be refused if the request is barred by limitation under the requesting country's law, or if the individual is already facing trial or serving a sentence in India. Extradition can also be refused if the request appears to be targeted at a person's race, religion, nationality, or political opinions, and extradition can also be denied if the requesting state if the requesting state cannot assume that the fugitive will only be tried for the offense specified in that particular request. So these are various conditions and provisions. You have to have an idea about it. The major focus of this being that there are certain exceptions to when extradition is given. Like certain situations, we do not allow extradition to happen. This you can have rough idea about. You don't need to really memorize it, but if you have rough idea about it, you will not forget it also. Then comes next part, which is Biological Weapons Convention and its 50th anniversary. Okay, so what do you need to know about it? You have to understand that Biological Weapons Convention is an international treaty banning development, production, and stockpiling of and use of biological and toxic weapons. Now, 50th anniversary of this weapons convention has been celebrated recently. It was observed in December, and our foreign minister also gave a speech there. So it's a very important convention. You have to know about it. It came into force in 1975. It prohibits transfer and acquisition of biological weapons and toxin weapons. It is the first multilateral treaty to ban an entire category of weapons of mass destruction. So in 1975, it was one of the first such treaties or conventions which were aiming at banning an entire category of weapons of mass destruction. That we have to be clear about. Then what else do we need to know about this is that the request, it is also required that state parties destroy existing stockpiles, take national measures against those weapons, and cooperate on compliance issues. Okay. The biological, however, one limitation you have to be clear about with regards to Biological Weapons Convention is the fact that it does not have a formal verification body, which has led to discussions about strengthening its implementation. So, like, while it has a great format, while it has a great theoretical coverage of and control of biological and toxin weapons, at the same time, it does not have a good implementation as well as a good verification regime. Okay. Unlike the Chemical Weapons Convention, Chemical Weapons Convention has a challenge inspection method associated with it, which basically allows any state party to challenge the regime of chemical weapons control in another country. That way, they are able to ensure a better check on the implementation of that particular convention. Okay, so we'll be clear about this particular part. Then we'll start off with the next topic, which is Bangladesh accession to UN Water Convention. Just give me 15 seconds. Yes. So now we start off with Bangladesh's accession to the UN Water Convention. Okay, so Bangladesh accession has happened recently. It has become the first South Asian nation to join the UN Water Convention. So what all do we need to know about the UN Water Convention? We need to know that it was created in 1996 to promote cooperation and sustainable management of shared water resources. Okay, it is a legally binding convention, and it was first originally intended only for European and Central Asian countries, but it was later on in 2016 it was opened for signature as well as for ratification by other UN member states. It so what it does, what actually happens when somebody signs the UN Water Convention is basically that they are trying to have a, a more sustainable and cooperative water sharing regime. Okay, so given that Bangladesh is a lower riparian state, okay, it is a lower riparian state. It depends on India, it depends on China for most of the water that it gets. Right, the river water that comes into Bangladesh comes either from India or from China. So it had concerns, right, with regards to its sustainability of water resources. That is why it has ratified this convention, okay, and signed the convention. So that is something that we have to be clear about. However, we also need to know that India and China are not parties to this UN Water Convention. Also, it does this particular convention cannot replace basic specific frameworks. है ना? So bilateral negotiations still remain extremely important for Bangladesh for any of the provisions of UN Water Convention to be put on ground. Okay, so that is one thing that we need to be clear about. Then comes Maputo Protocol. What we have to know about this? The only thing that we have to know is that it's an African treaty and that it is related to women's rights. These two things we'll know, and that is all. Okay, so it is a treaty focused on women's rights and legally obligates signatory states to eliminate discrimination and promote equality. So that is something that we'll be clear about. Then comes the next part, which is global economic and strategic affairs, security and strategic affairs. We need to be clear about all these topics. We start from the first one, which is shutdown in the USA. So what do we need to know about this? So we need to know that US has been in a shutdown mode for a lot of for a lot of days in the past year. We need to know what a shutdown means. So a shutdown is that when the US government and its agencies have no money to spend and it halts many services and cripples parts of the economy. Okay, India may it doesn't happen much, but in US shutdown has already happened 11 times. Okay, so what is a shutdown? It basically reflects loss of parliamentary permission to tax and spend, not an absolute lack of money. Okay, that is something that we have to be clear about. So even when US does have the money or the president also does have money, it cannot spend it because the parliamentary permission is missing. Then comes why India does not face similar deadlocks. Why do we not have such a system of shutdown? That is because India's executive is part of the legislature itself. So the government generally passes the budget provisions it proposes. However, if the budget is not passed, then it will lead to lead to loss of trust and will require the prime minister to resign by law. So with regards to India, we have to be clear that the shutdowns do not happen because we have a parliamentary system, unlike the presidential system in the US. Presidential system in the US means that president needs approval from the legislature with regards to spending of the money. However, when it comes to at the same time, because president is also an independent body and an independent head, it cannot be asked to resign if the budget is not passed. So in such cases, there is a shutdown in US. However, in case of India, because the executive is part of the legislature itself, if it fails to pass a budget, it is supposed to resign, right? So shutdowns do not happen. Direct resignation happens of the executive concerned, so that we have only an executive which enjoys confidence of the legislature. So that is something that we have to be clear about. Then comes sanctions on Iran. So what we've been seeing of late is that Iran has been enriching its uranium fuel, right? And it is trying to create weapons grade यूरेनियम, राइट? तो लाइक आपको ये चीज आपको पता है, इस लेवल की एनरिचमेंट हो रही है. एंड यूएन सिक्योरिटी काउंसिल, what it has done of late is that it has reimposed sanctions on Iran for violations of the 2015 JCPOA. ठीक है, JCPOA was signed between the P5 as well as with the Iran to control the uranium enrichment program of Iran, okay, and to promote peace and security in the Middle East. Now, the concern is that Iran's economy is already strained by water and power shortages. It also has a budget deficit. It has a devalued currency. At the same time, when such sanctions by UNSC come, then they are going to cripple and deteriorate the economic situation of Iran further. And it can lead to certain security threats in that particular region, right? So, apart from having understood this part, we have to also understand with regards to uranium enrichment. What do we need to know about uranium enrichment is that natural uranium is mostly 238. Okay? Uranium 238 is the most dominant form of natural uranium. However, it is not fissile. So when we say that something is not fissile, what we mean is that this particular type of atom cannot do a chain reaction by itself. Okay? It cannot do chain reaction by itself. And U-235 is the fissile isotope. So that is used in nuclear power plants for the chain reactions, for the creation of weapons also. It is the U-235 only that can be used. Okay? More than 99% of natural uranium is U-238, and U-235 is the lighter fissile isotope. Enrichment process increases the concentration of U-235 in uranium. Okay? So basically, our goal with uranium enrichment is to increase the concentration of U-235 in the overall uranium. When we enrich it to about 3 to 5%, that is more than enough to create nuclear power reactors. So basically, for civilian power purposes, 3 to 5% of uranium enrichment is more than enough. However, what we've been seeing in Iran is that the enrichment has already crossed more than 60%, which clearly indicates that this is not being done for power. Okay, this is not being done for electricity. What they are instead moving into is weapons grade enrichment. Okay, but weapons grade uranium is arrived when 90% enriched U-235 is created. Okay, highly enriched uranium is anything beyond 20% of uranium enrichment. Okay, so this is what we have to be clear about with regards to Iran sanctions. With regards to Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact, we have to only know that the name of the agreement is Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, and this agreement was signed between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia recently, where what they promised is that any aggression against either of the country will be considered as aggression on both. Now, despite this particular wording of the clause and wording of this, in the agreement, it is being said that it, considering the strong, close relations that Saudi has with India as well, it is highly unlikely that it will have any impact on South Asian conflict dynamics. So, India-Pakistan relations, it is not really expected it will create a lot of impact. Okay. Then we have to know about UN conference on landlocked developing countries. So what do we need to know about this? So in Avaza, Turkmenistan, there was a Avaza political declaration and Avaza program of action, which was signed recently. Okay? We had a third UN conference on landlocked developing countries in Avaza, Turkmenistan. Okay? This landlocked developing countries conference happens about every 10 years. So about every decade, we've had a conference since 2003. So the first one happened in Kazakhstan. The second one happened in Austria. Okay. Now, landlocked developing countries, what are they? So they are developing countries. That's very well understood. They are landlocked as well. And as you can see here, they face constraints due to lack of territorial access to the sea and high trade costs. So we know for a fact that, for example, even in case of India, more than 80% of our trade happens through maritime route, right? Through seas, etc. So for any country, the access to ports and access to the sea has been extremely important. However, these landlocked developing countries face this issue of having no direct access to the sea and thus having very high trade costs. Okay, so that we have to have rough idea about, and we have to also try to have a clear idea of the countries which are landlocked and developing. You will be able to understand and memorize this better if you will spend some time with the map and mapping all of these countries on the map. Then comes Global Outlook Council on Water Investment. So this particular initiative is by South Africa. And as we know, the recent G20 summit happened in Africa, South Africa itself. So there, this Outlook Council on Water Investment was launched by South Africa, and it is going to serve as a high-level platform to drive political and financial commitment for water security. That is what we have to be clear about. It's a G20 initiative. It is by South Africa, and it serves as a high-level platform to drive political and financial commitment for water security. Okay. It will track progress, unlock finance, and align efforts across G20 nations, UN nations, etc. Okay. Then comes next, which is state recognition of Palestine. Now, Palestine currently is not recognized as a state. Okay. It is an observer state at the United Nations. To become a full member, full UN member state, any particular observer state would require these things. One, that it would need a UN Security Council recommendation, and it would also need 2/3 majority vote in the General Assembly. If either of these does not work out, then that particular observer state cannot convert into a full UN member state. And another thing is very important is that veto works well to restrict the observation or recognition of any particular state or observer state as a full member state. Okay. So like all of the P5 countries can veto a membership application. That is something that we have to be clear about. Then comes ICJ's climate ruling. What do we know about ICJ's climate ruling? We have to know multiple things. First, we have to know that International Court of Justice is located in Peace Palace, Hague, and has been looking into various issues of international governance. They are also looking into international environmental governance, international, jurisdictions, etc. So they are looking into a lot of important matters. And in that context, last year, the ICJ gave a judgment. It was an advisory judgment. It was an advisory opinion, not a judgment. It was an advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice that countries do have a legal obligation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they can be held liable for failing to do so. So if the countries, both developed as well as developing countries, do not reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they can be held liable for failing to do so. Okay. And the ICJs, we have to also understand that ICJ's advisory opinion is not binding. It is not considered a legally binding international law. Okay, but it is an authoritative interpretation on that particular subject. Okay. About the International Court of Justice, you have to know that it is one of the 6 principal organs of the UN. It's the only principal organ of the UN which is not located in New York. Peace Palace, The Hague. Then it was established in 1945. Okay, and it was the successor to the Permanent Court of International Justice. All members of the UN are automatically of the ICJ statute. Now you have to understand this, that here the ICJ is a principal organ of the UN, right? So when it is a principal organ, there are only 6 principal organs. It's also like logical that all members of the UN are becoming automatically the members of the ICJ. If you would not know this, and if you have not read it, and if you have not thought through, then in the exam hall you might start questioning this particular statement. Okay. And at the same time, you have to also know that even when all members become a member of it, ICJ does not directly get jurisdiction of over the disputes between them. The ICJ gets jurisdiction only when both the parties concerned give a consent to it. Okay. Then the judgment of the International Court of Justice is final, and it is also binding on the parties to a case. However, and it also does not have a provision of appeal. However, you have to also understand that ICJ is also not having a way to ensure the compliance of its orders or judgments. Okay. What you would also know is that there are 15 judges in the International Court of Justice who are elected for 9-year terms. So 15 judges for 9-year terms is what you will have in the International Court of Justice. And they are elected by the UNGA and Security Council, both of which vote simultaneously but separately. A third of the court is elected every 3 years, and the president, vice president of the court are elected for 3-year terms by secret ballot and the judges are eligible for re-election. So we also need to know that India has had judges also in the ICJ, and India has also had cases that were that reached the International Court of Justice as well. So we understand that this particular part. We also are able to appreciate, I hope you are able to appreciate that ICJ's judgments are legally binding, but their advisory opinion is not legally binding. It also flows from the word itself. If something is advisory opinion, then the likelihood of that being legally binding is extremely less. Okay? So we understand this as well. Then comes major conflicts in news. So the major conflicts that were in news, if we start looking at it, the most important one of them being the Israel-Palestine issue and the famine that we are seeing in Gaza. Okay? So this happened. We know for a fact that the UN, the IPSC, International Food Security, Integrated Food Security Classification, has declared a famine in this particular region of Gaza. And we have to have a rough idea about this whole declaration of famine. Okay? The criteria by the IPC is that 20% of households need to have an extreme lack of food or must be starving. 30% of children aged 6 months to 5 years should be suffering from acute malnutrition, and the mortality threshold should be that at least 2 people or 4 children under 5 should be dying due to starvation or interaction of malnutrition and disease. That you have to be clear about. Okay? So rough idea about these conditions is important. At the same time, we also need to know about IPC itself. So it was set up in 2004 and it is coordinated by the Food and Agricultural Organization. It was developed during the food emergency in Somalia, and the definition of famine emphasizes extreme deprivation with starvation, death, destitution, and extremely critical levels of acute malnutrition. So we are clear about this. Okay? Then comes the next one. So in the next topic, which is US naval moves against Venezuela. About Venezuela, we are going to read much more in the second part, the update of laser focus. We'll start discussing about the geography of Venezuela and so on. But here in this particular article, context of this particular article, we are only going to understand about what are US sanctions, what are secondary sanctions, what is petrodollar, and what is the impact of that on international relations. So US President Donald Trump basically announced a total and complete blockade of sanctions, blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers going to and out of Venezuela. So that happened. The sanctions were announced by the US. Now, these sanctions are basically possible by a country like the US because it has a control over the overall transactions that happen in the oil industry, oil and petroleum industry. Okay? Because oil and petroleum industry is an international industry and the payments are supposed to be done in currencies which are acceptable to both parties, since dollar is the dominant currency across the world, petrodollar has become the way most of the transactions happen in the petroleum and oil industry. Okay? So that is something that you have to know clearly, and that is why we say there is a control over the petrodollar. Okay? The petrodollar basically indicates the dominance of dollar in oil related transactions. Okay? Global oil related, crude oil related transactions, etc. We also need to know that secondary sanctions are what the US is able to put. Generally, primary sanctions can only be put by the United Nations Security Council. And what kind of sanctions are they? So the US tries to stop the countries from its own companies from trading with sanctioned countries and companies from sanctioned countries. Okay? Another fact that you can probably know is with regards to the International Association of Classification Societies. Classification societies, what they do is they certify ships. Okay? And Indian Register of Shipping is an IACS member. Okay? This is what we will still remember about this particular topic. We'll have so what all did we learn from this topic? We learned about the meaning and significance of petrodollar. We also learned about the International Association of Classification Societies. We also learned about broader understanding of secondary sanctions by the US, through which it tries to control and dictate its own foreign policy globally. Then we go to the border dispute that's happening between Thailand and Cambodia. We have to have a clear understanding that it is a historical dispute, and the center of the dispute is the Dankrek mountain range and the Previhar temple. Okay, the temple is basically located in this particular range of Dankrek mountain range. You find this particular Previhar temple. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it was built during the Khmer Empire. Okay, that we have to know. In 1962, the International Court of Justice had actually upheld Cambodia's claim over the Privy. However, Thailand is not very happy with it, and that is why regularly the disputes have been there, and now the disputes have converted into border skirmishes, conflicts, etc. So we have to know this. We have to know also the bordering countries of these particular countries concerned, as we can see in the map. So we should have an idea of which countries border Thailand, which countries border Cambodia, which countries probably border Myanmar as well. So this is important for us, as well as Laos. We have to know the bordering countries to all of these. Okay. So this is extremely important. I hope you would have clarity on this. Then comes the next part. The next topic is behind Israel's recognition of Somaliland, strategic geopolitical interests at work. So what all do we need to know from this particular topic? So the most important thing that we have to know is that Israel has become the first country in the world to have legally recognized Somaliland as an independent sovereign state. Okay? So Israel has been the first one to recognize Republic of Somaliland as an independent and sovereign state. And then we need to have a rough idea about the location of Somaliland. As you can see here, you're able to see Somaliland lies here. You're able to see Djibouti lies here. You're able to see there is a disputed area and Puntland lying on the right side of Somaliland. And you can see that at the south, you find Ethiopia, etc. in the case of Somaliland. So you are able to see the geography of this particular region concerned, right? It is a autonomous area. Currently, Somalia does not believe that and does not accept that it is an independent part. Okay? But Somaliland considers itself an independent and autonomous region. Then comes the next topic, which is Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. And at the center of that conflict has been Nagorno-Karabakh. What happened last year was that the US, President Trump, tried to negotiate a peace deal. And in that peace deal, he gave a lot of those conditions, etc., with regards to the agreement. What we can focus upon, however, is the autonomous Nakhchivan exclave, which is related to Azerbaijan. Okay? And it will basically connect this from the mainland Azerbaijan with the 32-kilometer patch of Armenian territory. ठीक है, तो ये होने वाला है. This is something that you have to be clear about. This exclave you need to know about, that it is of Azerbaijan. You have to also know about the conflict that it was between the Armenia and Azerbaijan. Then comes next, which is Russia having recognized Taliban government of Afghanistan. We have to know clearly that recognition of Taliban has not been something that India has accepted. Several other countries have not legally recognized Taliban control of the Afghanistan region, right? But Russia has become the first one, and they are trying to get some kind of leverage in that region. We don't need to really go much into detail beyond it. Then comes the next one, which is with regards to the tensions that are taking place in Yemen. We need to know certain things. First, we need to know about the Southern Transitional Council. The Southern Transitional Council is basically backed by the UAE and has been at odds with the Yemen's internationally recognized government. What it has been wanting, however, is that they want to create a Southern Yemen, independent Southern Yemen for themselves. Okay? That we can have certain idea about. So we have to have an idea about the Southern Transitional Council. At the same time, we also need to know about various places that have been in news with regards to it. We'll read those places in the next part of this session, right? So then we come to places in news, various places that have been in the news recently. The most important one among those being the Sar Creek. So Sar Creek is basically at the border of India and Pakistan. Okay? It is a disputed area. Originally, it is called Banganga. It is a fluctuating 96-kilometer tidal estuary along the India-Pakistan border. Okay? It has been in the news. A lot of dispute happened. Okay. To its west lies the Run of Kutch, and to its east lies the Run of Kutch in Gujarat, and to its west lies the province of Sindh in Pakistan. The most important part among all of this is that while Sir Creek is distributed, the main discussion has been happening about around a principle called as Thalweg principle. Okay? Now, what is this Thalweg principle? It basically says that if a water course is navigable, then the middle of that particular channel is the boundary between two countries concerned whenever it is applicable. India has been arguing that despite fluctuations, Sar Creek does fall under the Thalweg principle because it remains navigable and is frequented by fishermen. Okay. That is what India claims. However, what Pakistan claims is that no, it is not a navigable channel and hence we cannot consider it within the Thalweg principle. But you have to just know about the principle concerned. Okay. They will not ask about the stance of various countries, but still, at least you should have an idea that India does believe that it is like, the principle applies to that region. Okay. Then comes the various other places in news that are there. Let's say, for example, Tira Valley. It is in Pakistan. Bagram Air Base is in Afghanistan. Okay. Tira Valley, you're able to imagine Pakistan. You're also able to understand that Pakistan does have a lot of valleys in the northern and northwestern region of it, right? So if you read this particular name, you are able to recognize that it will be in Pakistan. Okay, it was in the news in the context of tensions that are ongoing between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Okay, the Bagram Air Base was established by the USA in Afghanistan when it was controlling that particular region. Right, it was established in Kabul in Parwan province, and it was serving as the central hub during the Afghan war from 2001 till 2021. Now, why is in the news again? Because the US President Trump is saying that we want to reclaim this particular airbase of Bagram. Okay. The Mar del Plata is basically it's a city in Argentina. We don't need to know much about it, but we just want to know that this is a city in Argentina. Okay. With the name also, it is like easy to understand that it will be somewhere in the South America. However, we can just remember that it is Argentina. Okay. The Carlsberg Ridge is important, and it is important for the fact that we've gotten rights. India has gotten rights for exploration of polymetallic sulfide nodules, polymetallic sulfide exploration in this particular region, right? So this we have to be clear about. Okay, so it is basically in a mid-oceanic ridge where the Arabian and Somali plates are spreading. Okay, so yeah, we have to be clear about. Then comes Scarborough Shoals. So Scarborough Shoal, what do you need to know about this? We have to know that it is a triangular atoll, okay, about 200 kilometers from the Philippine coast. So it is in that same region of southeast, basically South China Sea. It's in Southeast Asia, and it is in that South China Sea region where conflicts around its ownership have been there for a very, very long while. Okay. The China claims a very large portion of the South China Sea, and it demarcates it through the 9-dash line. Okay, it demarcates it through the 9-dash line. Other countries in the region do not actually subscribe to that understanding of China and have regularly raised concerns about it. Okay, so we have to know that Scarborough Shoal is also that disputed region between Philippines and China. Then comes Aini Air Base. What do we need to know about Aini Air Base? We need to know that India had built and was maintaining the Aini Air Base in Tajikistan for a couple of decades. However, it has slowly started to withdraw from it. Okay, so this particular Aini Air Base is in news from Tajikistan because India has withdrew its withdrew from this airbase recently. Mazar-e-Sharif, we have to know that it is in Afghanistan, and a powerful earthquake struck near this particular region in Balkh and Samangan provinces in November 2025. Okay, we'll know this. Then comes Mount Semeru in Indonesia. So we know that several, like Indonesia is the hub of those extremely active volcanic eruptions, like call it call it Mount Semeru. There is another one like Mount Levotobi, Laki Laki. You must have heard of that mountain as well, like a volcanic eruption, and several other ones are located in this region itself. Okay, Indonesia is a hub of it, so this one we can remember. Another one is Heligabbi, which we know is located in Ethiopia, and it recently erupted after 12,000 years. Another volcanic region is the Popocatépetl volcano, which is in Mexico. Okay, and it was the first time in 2025 that scientists were able to obtain first 3D images from inside this particular volcano, despite it being one of the most active volcanoes in the world. So, the access to data of it was less and was not covered much, but now it is. Then another one is with regards to Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Okay, all of these are located in Iran. We have to know them. Okay, what happened with regards to these nuclear facilities were that they were also bombed by US and Israel recently. Okay, Crete Island is located in Greece. There were massive wildfires that happened there in this Crete Island. We'll remember this. We'll also remember Tokara Island, which are located in Japan. Why would we remember them? And that is because it more than 900 earthquakes rocked this particular island chain in Japan. So we know for a fact that Japan is actively it's located in a seismically very active region. Okay, it is in that ring of fire zone, and a lot of earthquakes happen in this particular region, right? So Tokara Island chain was in the news for having more than 900 earthquakes, so which is basically like an earthquake swarm, and all of that happened in just 2 weeks. Darfur, Sudan was in news. Why was it in the news? Because a landslide wiped out a whole village in Darfur, killing an estimated 1,000 people, according to the rebel groups in that particular region. So we have to know about this particular fact. Okay? We have to know that a landslide led to more than 1,000 fatalities in Darfur, Sudan. Mugalla port is in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia basically bombed this particular port in Yemen. Okay? This we have to know. We also need to know about Rafah, Khan Yunus, Maghazi Camp, Beit Lahiya. All of these are located in Gaza Strip, and we know for a fact that the conflict has escalated in that particular region, right? So several of these places are continuously in the news. Mount Etna, another volcano, okay, most active volcano of Italy, and it erupted again in December 25. So Mount Etna keeps on erupting almost every year. There is hardly any year where you wouldn't hear about this particular volcano, erupting. So we know that it is one of the most active volcanoes in the world, actually. Then comes Palmyra, which is in Syria. And why was it in news? It was in news because US carried out large-scale strikes on this particular region in Syria under Operation Hawkeye Strike, and this happened because it was in the retaliation of the death of some soldiers in Syria, etc. So that is what we'll know. Then comes next, which is Bondi Beach in Australia. We know that there was a terrorist attack that happened in Bondi Beach, okay, and it was extremely deadly, and it was in the news. So we need to have a rough idea about this beach, okay. Then comes Uvira in Congo. So Democratic Republic of Congo is in the news. We know that there has been an internal strife. There has been a problem between the paramilitary forces as well as the army of that particular region. Okay. So that led to a lot of conflict and a lot of civil war type situation. This Uvira is a city in Kivu province in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Okay. The Rwanda-backed M23 rebels claimed to have withdrawn from Uvira in Eastern Congo. That was the reason why this was in the news, and it was in the headlines of several articles. So we would want to memorize this place clearly. Okay. Then comes Mahara and Hadramaut Governorate. So these two are also very important, Hadramaut and Mahara. Both of these are located in Yemen, and again, as we discussed earlier as well, there has been a instability in the Yemen region, and there have been like Saudi attacks, etc. also in that region. So in that context, we'll remember about these. We already discussed about Southern Transitional Council as well. So they have been moving into regions of Yemen, like in Hadramaut and Mahara, and they have seized oil-rich region, and they are claiming their ownership. Okay. Al Fasher in Sudan is also extremely important. and it is located in Darfur region itself. We already discussed the Darfur region where more than 1,000 people died because of landslide as well, right? So all of this you need to be clear about. Then comes next, which is the countries, various countries in news. What all do we need to know about the countries that were in news? So UPSC does ask questions related to countries in news as well. How do they ask generally is that either they will ask it in a match the following format, match it format, wherein they'll give list of countries and they'll ask why were they in the news, or what they'll do is they'll club certain common type of countries in news and they'll ask for which of the following reasons were these in news. Okay. Just for example, if there are multiple countries where famine had happened, then they'll ask which of the following countries in the past year saw famines and death due to it. Okay. And if there are protests that happened, just for example, this year Gen Z protests have happened across the world. Several countries have witnessed Gen Z protests. So what they can do is they can separate all those countries and they can they can separate all those countries through a comma and they can ask with regards to which of the following, like why were these countries in the news of late? They can ask such a question. Okay, so that is why we need to know only the context very well of why a particular country was in news. Okay, so when it comes to Philippines, we are able to see that there were protests that happened in Philippines, and these protests were basically against corruption in public contracts. It was like a Gen Z protest only. Okay, in Philippines, it was against the quality of life issues, the corruption issues, governance issues, etc. That we have to be clear about. Okay, and France may, there has been political crisis that has been ongoing for a long while now. Okay, several times elections had to be called again and again and again. So we'll remember that. Indonesia also saw similar Gen Z protests. Okay, that we'll know. Nepal also saw similar Gen Z protests. The youth basically led anti-corruption protests after social media bans and visible elite ostentation. So all of this we will remember. These are the countries where Gen Z protests have happened. Venezuela was in the news because obviously it's having an economic crisis under Maduro, and now we know that the US has kind of taken over it as well. So this is important. It is important as a news. Okay? We need to know about the geography of Venezuela as well. Venezuela is also an OPEC member, and it also appeared previously in the question paper. And the fact that is extremely important is that it has world's largest oil reserves, though untapped, given the fact that processing of Venezuelan oil is a bit difficult. At the same time, like it is also sweet, right? So that is something that we will know about the Venezuelan oil. Then comes next, which is France, which is the Zuckman tax. So Zuckman tax is a proposed wealth tax, okay, which was basically suggested by an economist of France. We can remember about it a bit, but we'll not try to remember too much about it. What we'll also know is that what happened was that the Constitutional Court dismissed Prime Minister of Thailand over an ethics violation, and it was linked to a leaked call with Cambodian leader Hun Sen. Okay, so basically, it's a very unique way the Prime Minister was removed. That is why even the context of it is important. Okay. Then comes next, which is the Japan, which recently witnessed the first ever women president, okay, women Prime Minister of Japan, and it happened through a parliamentary vote. Okay. The Sanae Takichi became Japan's first female Prime Minister after a parliamentary vote. Bangladesh ka extension to the UN Water Convention we have already discussed. A very important part is also the Haiti's UNSC resolution 2793. What we have to understand is that Haiti is in the news for a very long while because of the violent gang. Okay? Basically, there is a gang violence that is happening in Haiti, and so as to check it, the UNSC resolution 2793 was passed, and it has converted the multinational security support in Haiti to a gang suppression force. Okay? So it will now create a support office to tackle gang violence as well as the related humanitarian crisis in Haiti. I do feel it's a very important development, so you should know about it. Okay? We also need to know about the withdrawal of Russia from the plutonium management and disposition agreement. So this agreement basically tried to check the overall plutonium production in these two countries and plutonium stockpile in these two countries. However, the Russia has decided to withdraw from it. So you can say effectively this treaty is going to be not enforced. It is going to be dropped. Another thing that we have to be clear about is that Italy recently banned, basically made femicide a separate criminal offense, okay, and it made a mandatory life sentence also in this particular offense of femicide. Okay. Now, Italy is not the first country to have made femicide a separate criminal offense. There are some other countries as well, but it is the recent one. So it is possible that they might ask you in the question with regards to it. They can have country of Italy and they can ask about the femicide part also. Australia also has been in the news for having become the very first country in the world to ban under 16s from social media platforms. So adolescents under 16 have now been banned from use of social media in Australia. Okay? Very important. It has been in the news. Many countries have been considering applying similar bans there. India also saw a debate around it. So we have to have a clear idea about it. Then comes next, which is France and Spain. And so a large portion of Europe last year saw wildfires, and it led to a lot of destruction of forest in that particular region. Okay? So we might want to remember, the locations mentioned like Galicia, Castellon, Caqueret. All of these are located in Spain, and Aude is located in France. Now, so you can remember them, but even if you don't want to remember them, that's not much of a concern. You should have a rough idea of that Europe, EU has been witnessing one of the worst wildfire seasons last year. Okay? Iran, we've already discussed. Iran has been seeing economic crisis. Okay? It has also seen widespread protests because of the currency crisis, because of the ongoing economic crisis in that particular country. Okay? Sri Lanka ke case mein, we have already seen that there was a public emergency which happened because of the destruction caused by the cyclone Ditwa. Okay? तो श्रीलंका के बारे में ये बताना चाहिए that India also supported this particular, India supported humanitarian assistance in this region through its operation Sagar Bandhu. ठीक है? And the Ditwa caused extensive destruction and it prompted emergency measures. ठीक है? Then we have to also know that Indonesia was in news given the fact that it saw lots of floods and landslides, and these killed over 1,000 people in Sumatra, okay, in December 2025. So that is very important. We also need to know that in Guinea-Bissau, a military coup happened, and military coup has already been asked in previous year questions as well. So we have to know that Guinea-Bissau, which is basically an African country again, saw the military, came under a military rule now, and it is basically, in the continents of various political instabilities happening in the African region. Bhutan was in the news last year for having hosted the Global Peace Prayer Festival. Okay? And India also sent across some key relics from, Buddhist sites in India to this Peace Prayer Festival. Okay? Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, and all of these countries were in the news because of the Hurricane Melissa. Okay, so Hurricane Melissa was one of the strongest in over 150 years. It struck these countries and it led to landslides, floods, and widespread damage in these regions of Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, etc. Okay, we also need to know that Vietnam has recently recorded extreme rains and flash floods, and it led to killing of 35 people and a lot of loss of cattle. Okay, that is what we have to have an idea about with regards to the various countries in news. So once countries in news is done, we go to some major summits and conferences in news. Earlier, we've already covered a lot of summits and conferences in the organization part. Here, we just discuss the most important ones, the last ones that we need to know of. So the ones that we have to know here are, first is with regards to the 4th Financing of Development Conference, FFD conference. It held in Sevilla, Spain. Okay? And it was with regards to UN-led, it was a UN-led conference. It was with regards to financing for development. As you can see it in the name itself. Okay? an important outcome of this, you can say, Sevilla strategy was there, and an important outcome of that was the Sevilla Forum on Debt. While it was actually finalized at the UN CAT UNCTAD meeting, 16th UNCTAD meeting at Geneva, however, it was basically an outcome of like basically a suggestion from the fourth FFD. Okay? And this Sevilla Forum is also led by Spain. We need to know that it is related to global sovereign debt crisis. We know that debt crisis is a thing in Spain, right? And in the world, we know that a lot of countries, especially African countries, a lot of countries, even in Asia, are facing mounting debt. Okay? So, which has been a concern raised by several organizations. There were certain support systems that were also launched during and post COVID, like a G20 common framework. G20 common framework. There has been a previous year question on G20 common framework already. So we know for a fact that UPSC does focus on this particular matter. Another important topic is the 11th UN Alliance of Civilization Forum. Okay? It took place in Saudi. So we have to know, certainly the location at which this conference happened. We also need to know that it was established by Kofi Annan in 2005. Okay? Kofi Annan was a UN Secretary General, and it attempts to galvanize international action against extremism. Okay? So I think this is fairly logical for us to understand that it will be, against religious extremism. It will try to forge international intellectual and interreligious dialogue. And India is a part of UN Alliance of Civilization. This is what we have to be clear about. And another topic that we can just have certain idea about is the Indo-Pacific Logistics Network. We can know that it is an initiative of Quad. Okay? If we know all of this, it's more than enough right now. There are several other updates also we'll discuss in the laser focus update also, which will come out in March, and also the contemporary affairs compilation, which will come out soon, which we'll discuss, and that will cover our international relations part of current affairs completely. Okay. All right. So we'll wrap this session up here, and we'll see in the next session.